Again, I'm back. September 26th. Washington Mutual was one of the biggest thrift companies, a big provider of subprime mortgages. It was closed by regulators on September 25th after parts of the company were split off. JP Morgan Chase acquired this company as well. On October 3rd, Wachovia, one of the five biggest banks in the United States, came under serious pressure and was acquired by Wells Fargo, another large mortgage provider. Or the firms I'm talking about were among the top 10 or 15 financial firms in the United States, and similar things were happening in Europe. So this was not a situation where only small parts were affected. Here we had the largest, most complex international financial institutions on the brink of failure. Let's review the lessons from the Great Depression, which I discussed in the first lecture. First, the Fed did not do enough to stabilize the banking system in the 1930s. And so the lesson there is that in a financial panic, the central bank has to lend freely according to Budget's principle to halt runs and to try to stabilize the financial system. Second, the Fed did not do enough to prevent deflation and contraction of the money supply in the 1930s. So, the second lesson from the Great Depression is that you need to have accommodative monetary policy to help the economy avoid a deep recession. So, heeding those lessons, the Federal Reserve and the federal government took vigorous actions to stop the financial panic, working domestically with other agencies and internationally with foreign central banks and governments. Now, one aspect of the crisis that I think does not receive enough attention is that it was global. In particular, Europe as well as the United States was suffering very severely from the crisis. But it was also a very impressive example of international cooperation. On October 10, 2008, who was the Nobel Prize winner in 2008? Paul Krugman? As it happened, there was a previously scheduled meeting in Washington of the G7 industrial countries, the seven largest industrial countries, and the central bank governors and the finance ministers of those seven countries met in Washington. Now I will tell you a deep, dark secret. These big, high profile international meetings are usually a terrible bore because much of the work is done in advance by the staff. We have a discussion, but the communique has already been written by the staff, and in most cases, what happens at the meeting is fairly routine. This was not one of those boring meetings, though. We essentially tore up the agenda and discussed what we should do. How should we work together to stop this crisis that was threatening the global financial system? In the end, we came up with a statement of principles that was written from scratch based on some Fed proposals. Among those principles were that we would work together to prevent the failure of any more systematically important financial institutions. This was after Lehman Brothers had failed. We would make sure that banks and other financial institutions had access to funding from central banks and capital from governments. we would work to restore depositor confidence and investor confidence, and then we would cooperate as much as possible to normalize credit markets. This was a global agreement, and the following week, the United Kingdom was the first to announce a comprehensive program to stabilize its banking system. The United States announced major steps to put capital into our banks and so on. So a lot happened in the next couple of days after this meeting. To show you how effectively this worked, Figure 24 graphs the interest rate charged on overnight loans between banks. The interbank interest rate, normally, the overnight interest rate between banks is extremely low, far less than 1%, because banks need some place to park their money overnight, and they have a lot of confidence that it is safe to lend to another large bank overnight. As you can see, starting in 2007, banks lost confidence in one another, which is shown by the increase in the rates they charged one another to make loans. For example, in 2007, we began to see the pressures as house prices began to fall, and there were increasing concerns about the quality of mortgage securities and the financial soundness of firms. In March 2008, we can see another little peak around the time Bear Stearns was forced to sell itself. That was not look like them that does not look like much in comparison to what happened later, but that was a very difficult period. It was a period of quite sharp movements in financial markets and in funding markets. Now look what happened in response to Bear Stearns' liquidity problems. There was an enormous spike in interbank market rates, and probably not much lending was taking place even at those high rates. This indicated that suddenly there was no trust whatsoever, even between the largest financial institutions, because nobody knew who was going to be next, who was going to fail, who was going to come under funding pressure. All right, that's it.